This is Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, Part 3, in which we look at the speech and praise of Abraham. In the opening of this section, we are told that there is a need for heroes as well as for the poets to sing the praises of these heroes. Kierkegaard writes, "The poet is, so to speak, the hero's better nature, ineffectual certainly as memory is, but also transfigured as a memory is. Therefore, one who was great will never be forgotten." So the poet or the author is somebody who is going to come along and be a necessary figure for anyone to survive. You look at the billions upon billions upon billions of people that have existed on this planet and think of how few of those are actually remembered. We began this course with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh lived about 5,000 years ago, but yet we still remember his name. We have looked at the legends of Plato and Aristotle, living 2,500 years ago. Abraham in the story lives almost 4,000 years ago. There are a handful of people who are remembered. There are a handful of people that we know because somebody took the time to write down their story. But those stories over time are going to become romanticized. They are going to become legend rather than history. When the poet romanticizes, he's going to take the individual's subjective nature and objectify it. So that what we need is to receive a concrete story, something that can be retold, maybe a list of facts to memorize. But in creating the myth that will live on, the real person ultimately dies. But because of this survival, the individual may live again through those people who transform him. On the screen, you have George Washington as a boy, and we have the story of Washington who chopped down the cherry tree and then said to his father that he couldn't tell a lie. He was the one who did it. Now that story, in all likelihood, and as far as every historian can make out, never actually happened. But yet it's a story that everybody is taught. It's a story that everybody knows. And it keeps the legend of the great father of this nation, the great George Washington, alive. Now, the thing is that once we have that individual, even in myth form, there is a chance that he can live again. If someone is completely and utterly forgotten, all those millions and billions of people who have gone on before us, that no one recorded their deeds, no one recorded their name, those people are just lost. But those individuals who are transformed by the poet into an object, into a thing, carry on that existence. And when someone like Kierkegaard comes along, he can take that objective nature and try to breathe subjectivity back into it. He can find a way or produce a way of trying to make things to where we can really understand that person and know who they really were. Not just the myth, not just the objective facts that were handed, but the real person, and try to bring that person alive before us. That's what he's trying to do with the story of Abraham. This story of the Akedah has been written down. It's been printed time and time again in Bibles all over the world. People have read it, they've memorized it, they've studied it. But beyond that, what have they done? Nothing. Those individuals don't tend to think about the issues. They just read it, recite it, and move on to the next thing. But if we really, like Kierkegaard was talking about in the last section, if we really take the time to put ourselves on that mountain, try to recognize him as a living, breathing human being, we can come to see the reality of him as a subjective being, facing all of the problems that any human being is going to face. We can make him alive again. Now, a transformation also implies that the more an individual loves the hero, the more people will stick by the hero and continue to perpetuate him. He says here, Everyone was great in his own way, and everyone in proportion to the greatness of what he loved. For he who loved himself became great in himself, and he who loved others became great through his devotion. But he who loved God became greater than all. Now, what we have is really a precursor here to a discussion in another one of Kierkegaard's books called The Concluding Unscientific Postscripts to Philosophical Fragments. He is introducing a concept called a leap of faith. And we'll talk a lot more about the leap of faith in the next section. But this leap of faith becomes very important because we have a tendency to become bogged down in the facts and figures. We have a tendency to want to objectify our own existence. And if we really want to take what he calls a true leap of faith, to have that ultimate meaningful connection and realization to the divine, then we have to let go of that objectivity, embrace the subjective, and come to accept that which is absurd or impossible. And this is something that ultimately, he says, takes the greatest of faith. If only he had been disowned, cast out from God's grace, he would have understood it better. When Kierkegaard raises this point in Fear and Trembling, he's talking about Abraham himself and the fact that here is an individual who has always stood in the shadow of God, someone who has always completely embraced God, and someone who always knew essentially that God had his back. Now, if he had been disowned, if he'd been cast away from God's grace, maybe he would have understood better what was going on. Because to receive the full blessing, according to Kierkegaard, one should be cast out, should ultimately lose everything. If we think about Abraham, Abraham was really a remarkable figure. He left behind everything that he was familiar with. He leaves his family, his friends, his home, his past cultural beliefs, everything. And he embraces the uncertain. He embraces the new. But this new was a temptation. And that temptation could drive him. Perhaps it too could become objectified. Perhaps it too could be grounded in fact. But if Abraham had been cast away, perhaps there would be a song of sorrow to sing. But always having God on his side, always validating his choices, leaves us to question whether he would still act for a God who cast him aside. And there's an additional level of doubt that comes into play. Would he still embrace the absurdity? If he would, then that faith would truly be great faith. There's a sense in which we recognize that when things are going well for a person, that obviously they have no problem in maintaining their sense of faith. They hold on to it firmly. Maybe they don't think about it too much, but they embrace it because it's there. But when things turn against them, and the more they turn against them, the more they turn towards faith in the hopes that that might elevate them and raise them up. On the screen here again, you have an image of Job. Job is the great character from the Bible who once was the great blessed one of God, who had everything going for him. But God and Satan are discussing at one point, and Satan says, well, of course Job is going to be this good and loyal subject to you. Everything always goes well. You always bless him so much. Let some evil come into his life, and let's see how quickly he turns against you. And so Job begins to lose everything. He loses his family, his health, his friends, his wealth, his animals, his stock. Everything is gone. But yet, Job remains faithful towards God, and because of that is rewarded many times over for his faithfulness. In essence, what Job exemplifies is the fact that really applies to almost everyone. The worse things become, the more we seek help from beyond. the worse our life becomes, the more fears and trepidation that we have, the more anxiety that we have, the more we're willing to make that leap of faith, the more we're willing to let go. And it also goes along with that idea we talked about back at the beginning, where Kierkegaard was letting go of his relationship with Regine Olsen. He was refusing to take the vows to enter the clergy because he didn't want anything that was going to ground him to this material plane. We have a tendency to want to stay inside the cave. We have a tendency to want to establish ourselves with what we know and what we're familiar with. But many times, as we've seen, the only way to advance, the only way to get something even greater is to let go of what you know and what you're familiar with. And so anything that is in your life is something that can ground you, that can pull you back into this world, can keep you here and not allow you to make that leap of faith. Anything. So, as it indicates here, when Abraham is going to leave behind everything that he was familiar with and embrace the uncertain, he understands, or should understand, that even the uncertainty itself could be a temptation. Anything has that capacity of transforming him from a living, breathing, subjective entity into an objective thing. And we have to let go in some way of that objectivity. Because it's that objectivity that prevents us from embracing the absurd. And ultimately, as we'll see through Kierkegaard's continued writings, we have to let go of that objectivity. We have to let go of everything that we're familiar with if we're going to make that leap of faith, because it means that we have to embrace that which is absurd. It was faith that made Abraham accept the promise that all nations of the earth should be blessed in his seed. Time went by, the possibility was still there, and Abraham had faith. Time went by, it became unlikely, and Abraham had faith. There was once another who held out an expectation. Time went by, the evening drew near. He was not so pitiful as to forget his expectation. Therefore, he too should not be forgotten. So, as you recall, God made a promise to Abraham that he would have this child who would go on to become the founder of a great nation. And Abraham accepted that based upon faith. And again, this faith has to be absolute. This faith has to have an absolute nature to it. It must be completely unshakable. Because what he's being asked to believe is an absurdity. From a rational standpoint, it's an impossibility. But yet he has to embrace it. And so we come to this wonderful definition of absolute faith, which Kierkegaard gives us here, and which later on the Jewish philosopher Emil Fackenheim is going to make use of as his definition, not just of absolute faith, but also of truth, a subjective truth. And he defines it as an objective uncertainty held fast through appropriation with the most passionate inwardness. An objective uncertainty held fast through appropriation with the most passionate inwardness. In other words, this is something that makes no sense whatsoever, something that is completely irrational, something that is utterly impossible, something there is no proof whatsoever to back it up. And yet, you're going to hold firmly to that belief no matter what. You stick to it. You stick by it. You are living your truth. Remember that language we looked at earlier. When you give yourself over in that way, you are basically living your truth. It's not some fact or figure to be memorized and recited back and forgotten. It's not something that you can lose yourself within. It is a fact that only exists because of you. That is your belief that keeps it alive. And so, looking at the story of Abraham with regards to this issue of absolute faith, as time passes, this promise that has been made to him becomes less and less certain of being fulfilled. The prospect of a 90-year-old woman, a 99-year-old man giving birth is completely absurd. But to embrace the absurd is to make it probable. And so it happens. The miracle occurs. But then Kierkegaard asks, well, wouldn't it have been better to have the child joyfully in youth rather than with such anxiety in old age? Is this God's promise? Is this what it means to be one of the chosen people of God? And this question that we see here sort of sums up the Yiddish phrase, Ol für Yiddishkeit. It's a burden to be the chosen people. I'm always reminded in the Fiddler on the Roof where Tevye is having one of his many conversations with God. And he says at one point, I think it's wonderful that we're the chosen people, but sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't have been better if you'd chosen somebody else. Because it is a burden. You are the one who is always being tested. You are the one who is always being challenged in one way or another. And so Kierkegaard, too, runs into that basic problem. He who is always prepared for the worst becomes old prematurely, but he who has faith retains eternal youth. And so one of the questions that frequently gets raised within this story is, again, it's wonderful that you have provided this miracle, but how is a 90-year-old woman, a 99-year-old man going to give birth? And even if they did, how are they going to look after this? I mean, someone of that advanced age to have to chase after a baby, a youth, and so on. Why couldn't I have not had this child when I was young where I could have enjoyed it? But Kierkegaard argues here that Abraham, even though he's old in time, by maintaining his faith was actually made young and ultimately even eternal. Abraham's faith was not just about a concern for the next life, but also about this life. Abraham could have offered himself in Isaac's place, or he could have begged God not to take his joy away, any of those scenarios that we looked at in the atonement, but he doesn't do this. Instead, Abraham embraces the absurdity of his situation, and he goes on living anyway. And that is the mark of someone who is prepared to let go of the objective world. That is the individual who is able to embrace that absurdity and take the leap of faith. Abraham is able to do that. And if we want a direct personal relationship with God, which is what all of this really focuses upon for Kierkegaard, then we have to be able to do the same thing. As this section closes, it says, "You who first saw and bore witness to this tremendous passion that scorns the fearful, struggle with the raging elements and the forces of creation in order to struggle with God instead. You who first knew that supreme passion, the sacred, pure, and humble expression of divine madness which the pagans admired, forgive him who would speak in your praise if he did not do it correctly. He spoke humbly, seeing it in his heart's desire. He spoke briefly, as is fitting. But he will never forget that you need 100 years to get your son of your old age, against every expectation, that you had to draw the knife before keeping Isaac. He will never forget that in 130 years you got no further than faith." And so Abraham does what must be done. He has that absolute sense of faith, and he lives on despite the absurdity of the situation, despite all of the paradoxes that are created. Kierkegaard recognizes that Abraham is the father of faith itself. And so we will move on to the problemata section in our next video.